I was lying in bed, almost falling asleep, when I heard his phone vibrating on the dresser. The screen lit up the dark room, and without meaning to, my eyes caught the detail that changed everything. It was a notification with a red heart emoji, accompanied by a name I didn't recognize. In that instant, my stomach churned and the air grew heavy. It wasn't a work message. It was something intimate, something that shouldn't be there. My heart raced and my hands began to sweat. I looked at him, sleeping peacefully beside me, as if nothing were happening. His breathing was calm, serene, almost mocking the agony building within me. My mind screamed questions I didn't have the courage to ask aloud. I tried to control my anger, but it felt like the floor of the room had disappeared. I felt my body shudder, as if I were about to fall into an abyss. I closed my eyes, but sleep would not return. That simple detail had the power to destroy years of life together. Inside me, a voice told me this was just the beginning, that something much bigger was hidden behind that notification. And the worst part was that, without knowing it, I was already entering a silent investigation that would completely change my life. The next morning seemed like all the others, but inside me, nothing was the same. I made coffee while he showered, feigning normalcy. The sound of the running water gave me time to gather my thoughts. The scene of the notification flashing on the screen wouldn't leave my mind. I knew I needed answers, but I still didn't have the courage to ask. He came out of the bathroom with a towel around his waist, fiddling with his phone as always. His eyes never left the screen, as if the device were more important than any glance from me. I sat at the table with my coffee cup, watching every move. He typed quickly with a subtle, almost imperceptible smile. It was like watching a movie in silence, but I already knew the ending. I was overcome by a mixture of anguish and self-preservation. A part of me wanted to snatch the phone from his hands right then and there. The other, colder one, told me to wait, to observe, to not be fooled again. I swallowed hard and smiled, disguising the lump in my throat. I was no longer living, I was acting inside my own home. I remembered our first years together, when he made a point of leaving his cell phone everywhere. Sometimes he even forgot to charge it, and I never doubted him. Now, the device felt like a safe, always with a password, always close by, as if it held his own life there. And maybe it did, just not the life we'd built. I tried to push my thoughts away as he said goodbye with a quick kiss. The kiss held no hint of affection, almost mechanical, emotionless. I closed the door and stood still, listening to the car start. The silence in the house suffocated me. I felt like every detail of my routine was about to become a clue. In the days that followed, I noticed how predictable his excuses had become. Meetings that never ended, constant delays, and always the same sweet smell on his clothes. I no longer needed to invent anything. Reality itself provided signs. But at the same time, I struggled with the idea of admitting it. Those who love always hope to be wrong. At the gym, I ran into a friend who mentioned seeing him on the street. She swore he was with someone, but couldn't say who. I smiled and changed the subject, as if it were a meaningless trifle. Inside, the information ate away at me like acid. That doubt became a blade I could no longer hold. That night, when he lay down beside me, I pretended to sleep. I heard my phone vibrate and the sound of keys being secretly typed. His breathing changed rhythms as he received messages. I knew that if I opened my eyes at that moment, I would see confirmation. But it wasn't time yet. I needed proof. I began to mentally note every detail. The perfume that wasn't mine, the times that didn't match, the distant glances. Life with him became a silent investigation. I began to store small fragments of the truth like someone collecting shards of glass. Painful, but necessary. The final straw came one Sunday, when he left saying he was going to play soccer. His uniform was in his backpack, but his soccer shoes were still in the locker. I went to the living room and minutes later saw the Uber notification on my phone, since the email was shared. The destination? A neighborhood that had nothing to do with soccer. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. I knew that route held an answer, but I couldn't rush yet. I took a deep breath and decided to wait. I waited for him to return to see if the lie would hold up. And when he walked in the door, sweaty beyond belief for someone who hadn't even soiled his sneakers, I realized the farce had a pattern. At dinner, while we talked, he made up details of the soccer match. He named friends, described plays, even complained about the referee who didn't exist. I chewed slowly, as if each bite were a poison I needed to swallow. I learned to smile on the outside while bleeding on the inside. It was a perverse act, but I already knew the script. It was around this time that my son began to notice my sadness. He watched me silently, perhaps sensing the change in the air. I tried to hide it, not wanting him to carry the weight of my doubts. But children sense what we don't say. And unwittingly, he would become the key to the truth. One ordinary afternoon, he ran into the living room with frightened eyes. "Mom, I saw Dad in the car with a woman." The innocence of the sentence was like a bomb exploding inside me. The world stopped, and I could only hug him so he wouldn't see my face. It wasn't just my intuition now, it was fact. The confirmation didn't come from screenshots, it didn't come from espionage. It came from the purest eyes I knew. That truth was impossible to ignore. And ironically, it was accompanied by the pain of knowing my son had witnessed the scene I so feared. He didn't deserve to carry that weight. I felt my legs give out, as if my body had lost all strength. It was a mixture of despair and certainty. My heart wanted to scream, but reason compelled me to maintain control. I couldn't let him see the extent of the destruction. The last thing I wanted was to traumatize him. I pulled my son close and, in a calm voice, asked him not to worry. I told him everything was fine, even though I knew nothing was. The words sounded false even to me, but I needed to protect him. At the same time, a decision was beginning to dawn on me. The lie could no longer go unpunished. The mask he wore in front of his family was about to fall. I no longer had any doubts. I was just waiting for the right moment to act. And, for the first time, I began to feel that I wasn't the one lost. It was he who was cornered. The path back to the truth was no longer avoidable. I didn't want any more explanations. I wanted justice. I wanted him to feel the same weight he'd made me carry in silence. I wanted his lie exposed, for the world to see who he really was. But before any confrontation, I needed to prepare myself. Organizing every detail, understanding every step, creating a strategy. It wouldn't be just an impulsive attack. It would be a planned revelation. And when the time came, he'd have no escape. At this point, I began revisiting our memories, trying to understand when everything was lost. The trips, the laughter, the plans. How could someone capable of swearing eternal love become such a cold stranger? The questions hurt me, but they also strengthened me. Because I was no longer just a deceived wife. I was a woman ready for the truth. And it was then that I realized the greatest betrayals aren't just physical, they're emotional. They're made of averted glances, of hidden messages, of secrets kept in silence. He hadn't been with me for a long time. Only his body remained by my side. The rest belonged to someone else. My son's look that afternoon was etched in my mind. It was like a warning I could no longer ignore. From that moment on, I was no longer just a victim. I became an investigator, a strategist, and soon, a judge of his fate. The tide was turning. My heart, though wounded, began to beat with a different rhythm. It was no longer just pain, it was determination. Betrayal would not be buried in silence, and even if the price was high, I would not back down. The truth had already invaded my home, and there was no way to drive it out. The next step would be decisive. I was ready to cross the line between doubt and action. Nothing would ever be the same again. The lie was surrounded and the truth, inevitable. He still believed he was safe. But little did he know that his every step was already marked. And when the moment came, the fall would be so brutal that even he would regret having underestimated my strength. That night, I lay beside him as if nothing had happened. The room was dark, but inside me was a whirlwind. His body was close, but the distance was immense. As he snored softly, I stared at the ceiling, remembering my son's words. Nothing else could be erased. His phone sat on the coffee table, charging silently. I was tempted to grab it, to type in the password I'd never learned again. I remembered the time when he'd ask me to answer messages for him. Today, such access seemed unthinkable. The trust that had once been natural was now an insurmountable barrier. I considered waking him up and spilling everything at once, but I realized that would mean handing him control of the narrative. I didn't want to be the desperate wife crying for attention. I wanted to be the woman who knew, who saw, who acted with clarity. And for that, I had to wait. The next day, I woke before him. I made the coffee, organized the kitchen, washed the dishes. I did everything mechanically, but with my mind elsewhere. As I stirred the spoon in the cup, my head spun with a single question. How far was he willing to put up with this charade? He appeared in the kitchen already dressed for work. His perfume was strong, overpowering, something I hadn't worn in years. I have a meeting today, he explained, without me asking. I smiled and nodded, swallowing the lump rising in my throat. With each detail, his act became clearer. I watched him walk out the door, adjusting the smartwatch on his wrist. This detail caught my attention. I knew the watch tracked steps, heartbeats, even locations. If there was a loophole, I would find the truth within that device. The technology he used to hide could also expose him. I spent the day trying to act normally. I worked, organized the house, talked to a friend, but everything seemed distant. I was physically present but mentally in another world. It felt like I was living a double life. The ordinary routine and the invisible war only I knew about. That night, he returned later than usual. He was carrying a bag from a store I didn't know. When I asked, he quickly replied, "It's a gift for a colleague at the office." There was no gift wrapping, no logic, but I didn't question it. I simply filed another lie away in my silent inventory. In the shower, I smelled that sweet scent clinging to his body again. A woman's scent, different from my own perfume, so familiar yet distant. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, feeling the pain gnaw at my chest. It was impossible to pretend it was a coincidence. My son entered the room at the same time and looked at me silently. He said nothing, but his gaze already held answers. Children understand much more than they let on. And in that moment, I realized I could no longer prolong this indefinitely. The lie no longer hurt just me, but him as well. I decided to begin my own practical investigation. I placed a small, discreet camera in the living room, pointed at the front door. Not because I expected a cinematic scene, but because I needed the peace of mind of knowing what was happening when I wasn't around. It wasn't about spectacle, it was about proof. I also began observing credit card details. Small purchases at restaurants at unlikely times. Ubers in neighborhoods where we didn't know each other. Everything aligned along an invisible line of betrayal. I no longer needed to imagine. The facts spoke for themselves. One Saturday, he said he was going to visit his mother. I stayed home with my son, but for some reason, I felt the urge to check. I opened my laptop and accessed the shared email account. There it was, a restaurant reservation confirmation for 2. The table had been reserved via his own cell phone. Disappointment was accompanied by a strange calm. It was as if I had been waiting for this very moment. The lump in my throat disappeared, giving way to a cruel clarity. Not only was he cheating on me, but he was doing it carelessly, believing he would never be found out. When he returned, he brought flowers. A beautiful bouquet, just like old times. I smiled, but inside I felt repulsed. The gift wasn't for me. It was meant to cover up the smell of lies. The irony was suffocating. How could anyone so underestimate the intelligence of someone who shares the same life? That night, his kiss tasted bitter. Not from his mouth, but from the deception imbued in every gesture. He spoke as if nothing had happened, as if it were just another day. I heard him, but no longer listened. My heart was cold, my mind calculating my next steps. The smartwatch vibrated on the table, and I fixed my gaze on it. It was like a constant reminder that technology could turn against him. All it took was patience, strategy, and the right moment. The secret was in his own wrist, pulsing with every lie. I began to realize how unbearable life became when divided between truth and theater. Every meal, every conversation, every night's sleep was a performance. I was no longer there as a wife. I was there as a witness, waiting for the final glimpse. My days became marked by this silent search. I observed, recorded, preserved. There were no screams, no arguments. Just an apparent calm that hid a hurricane. He believed he was deceiving, but it was he who was being monitored at every step. My son's gaze always returned like a weight. I saw in him the need for answers, even without words. I needed to act not only for myself, but for him. I couldn't let him grow up believing that lying was normal. This thought gave me the strength not to give up. One late afternoon, while sorting through the laundry, I found a crumpled receipt in his pants pocket. It was for a bakery, 2 slices of cake, and 2 coffees. Small, banal, but definitive. It wasn't takeout, it was a date. And not with me. My heart raced, but I didn't cry. I simply folded the paper and put it in my desk drawer. It was another piece of a puzzle that would soon be complete. He had no idea he was leaving such visible traces. The more I saw, the less I felt. The love that remained was turning into something hard, almost metallic. It wasn't about romance anymore. It was about emotional survival. I no longer sought answers, only proof. And when I gathered them all, the impact would be inevitable. I began to silently plan how to expose everything. I didn't want to just confront him. I wanted him to be crushed by his own lie, in front of those who believed his mask. It wouldn't be blind revenge, it would be justice. A cruel but deserved justice. At work, I noticed how he tried to maintain composure. He joked with colleagues, posted smiling photos on social media. But I knew the truth. It was strange to watch how he managed to live 2 lives without remorse. For me, there was no longer room for doubt. With each passing day, the emotional distance between us grew abysmal. We were under the same roof, but in completely different worlds. I no longer made plans, just waited for the right moment. The countdown had begun, even if he didn't know it. And it was in the midst of this waiting that I realized something even more painful. It wasn't just about me. It was about everything we'd built. Our family, our son, our memories. He hadn't just betrayed his wife. He'd betrayed the foundation of an entire life. The truth can't be postponed forever. It always finds a way to surface. And when it does, nothing remains the same. I knew the impact would be devastating, but I also knew I was ready. His downfall was already certain. All that remained was to choose the moment to push. With each piece of evidence I gathered, I felt my heart harden. There was no longer room for innocence, only for strategy. The woman who believed in promises no longer existed. In her place emerged a cold, firm, and implacable version. And in the silence of that house, I swore to myself, his mask would fall. Not just between 4 walls, but in front of everyone who believed the deception. He would have to look into the eyes of the one he deceived. And on that day, there would be no escape. The truth was about to explode, and I was no longer afraid. On the contrary, it was as if each lie he made fueled my courage. I no longer needed love. I only needed the right time. And that time was getting closer. He thought he controlled the game, but he was merely a puppet of his own error. The stage was set, and when the curtains rose, there would be no applause. There would only be the fall. On Monday, the routine seemed normal, but inside me, everything was different. His silence as he drank coffee, his hurried way of leaving the house, every detail seemed rehearsed. I noticed how he barely looked me in the eye before closing the door. It was as if I were just part of the scenery, no longer his life partner. I grabbed my laptop and calmly began organizing the traces I'd collected. Receipts, email screenshots, Uber schedules. It was no longer just a collection of clues, it was almost a dossier. With each recorded line, I felt my strength grow. I was no longer lost. I was prepared. Turning on the living room camera, I saw him quickly pass by to grab something before leaving again. There was nothing special about the gesture, but the rush betrayed anxiety. Those who have nothing to hide don't act so tense. I kept the recording as another piece of evidence. My son, innocent, continued to drop little clues without realizing it. "Mom, Dad didn't come home on time yesterday, did he?" The question cut me to the core. I simply said he was working, but the lie weighed heavily on me. I didn't want my son to witness all this, but he already was. At the gym, while pedaling on the exercise bike, I noticed my reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back at me wasn't the same. There were dark circles under her eyes, a hardness in her gaze. But there was also strength. I realized the pain was shaping me into something greater. I wouldn't just be the deceived wife, I would be the woman who would end the charade. I decided to try a new strategy. That night, when he arrived, I sat next to him and casually asked about work. He answered too quickly, as if he'd memorized a script. Every sentence seemed rehearsed, with no room for hesitation. It was at that moment that I realized he was already in constant defense mode. During dinner, I watched him fiddle with his phone under the table. His eyes flicked to the screen with irritating frequency. With each vibration, a subtle smile appeared. I chewed slowly, hiding the fire burning inside me. He thought I didn't notice, but I saw every detail. Later, when he went to take a shower, I left him watching TV and went to his backpack. I found nothing grand, just a hotel receipt, forgotten at the bottom. The detail about the double room left no doubt. I held the paper, took a deep breath, and put it back without changing anything. When he came out of the bathroom, he found me lying down, reading a book. I smiled naturally, as if life were perfect. But deep down, I had already crossed an invisible line. It was no longer about finding out. Now it was about deciding how and when to unmask him. That week, he began coming home with increasingly flimsy excuses. Last-minute meetings, business dinners, even short trips without warning. The lie no longer held water. It was like old fabric ripping at every pressure point. I just waited for the right moment to pull the final thread. At the company where I worked, some colleagues were already looking at me differently. One of them even commented cautiously, "I saw your husband the other day. He didn't seem alone." Feigning casualness, I thanked him for his concern. But inside, every sentence fueled the volcano I'd been keeping silent. My son began to grow quieter. His spontaneous laughter diminished, replaced by curious, apprehensive looks. He said nothing, but I knew I understood more than I wanted to. The betrayal wasn't just hurting me, it was corroding the atmosphere in the house. That was what upset me most. One rainy night, he returned with lipstick stained on his shirt. It wasn't much, just a barely visible trace near the collar. I was shocked to see how unconcerned he'd entered, oblivious to the detail. I was the one who had preserved that scene as if it were a portrait. It was no longer carelessness, it was disrespect. I lay beside him that night and wondered how many times I'd repeated that routine. How many lies had been told in the same calm tone. The betrayal was no longer just physical. It was emotional, spiritual. He hadn't been with me for a long time. I even became suspicious of the phone calls. The tone of his voice changed, his posture changed. A slight smile appeared when he answered unknown numbers. I pretended not to notice, but everything was etched in my mind. It wasn't jealousy, it was a realization. I began mentally planning the scene of the confrontation. I didn't want shouting, I didn't want tears. I wanted clarity, objectivity, firmness. I wanted him to feel the strength of someone who no longer needed explanations. I no longer sought answers, just exposure. One Saturday afternoon, I received a call from a strange number. When I answered, there was only silence, and they quickly hung up. But the detail didn't escape me. It was from the same neighborhood where he said he was going to play soccer. Coincidence? I no longer believed in coincidences. As time passed, my anger gave way to a calculated coldness. I no longer cried at night. I no longer despaired. I simply observed. It was as if I had become a different person. Someone more resilient, more attentive, more relentless. I realized how his life had become a constant performance. The way he spoke, his schedule, even his smile in front of his family. It was all a performance. But I knew no one can maintain a role forever. Eventually, the mask slips. Meanwhile, I continued collecting evidence. Photos, receipts, schedules, even memories of what he himself had let slip without realizing it. It was almost a police investigation, but conducted within my own home. I was the victim, but also the detective. My greatest pain was looking at my son and knowing that sooner or later he would understand the full extent of what was happening. I wanted to spare him, but how could I protect someone from a truth that had already infiltrated every corner of the house? With each week, my certainty grew. It was no longer about maybe, it was about when. Love had turned to ash. All that remained was the strength that stemmed from the desire for justice. Justice not only for myself, but for the impact he had caused on those who didn't deserve it. One day when I got home, I realized he'd left his smartwatch on the table. It was like finding the key to a safe. I held the device and considered how far I would go to access that information. It was as if the technology itself was conspiring in my favor. The mere fact of having that device in my hands gave me a sense of power. I didn't need to look at anything yet. Just knowing it was there strengthened me. It was as if the universe was telling me the time was coming. And I was ready. I left the watch in place without touching it. I wanted him to continue believing in control. The more confident he was, the greater the fall would be. And I was in no rush. Time this time was on my side. In the mirror, I began to see myself differently. I was no longer the deceived woman. I was the woman who held the truth. There was something hard in my gaze. Something even I found strange. The pain had become a weapon. Each night lying beside him, I knew the revelation was getting closer. What kept me going was the certainty that the lie wouldn't last forever. And when the mask fell, there would be no rebuilding. And it was in this certainty that I realized what was coming wouldn't just be a confrontation. It would be a shock that would change not only our lives, but the outlook of everyone who believed the farce. The downfall was approaching, and nothing could stop it. I woke up earlier than usual, feeling that the silence in the house was too heavy. I went to the kitchen and let the coffee maker run while I tried to organize my thoughts. Everything seemed the same, but nothing was the same anymore. The sound of coffee dripping into the pot reminded me that routine wasn't innocent, that every detail hid something bigger. I looked at the cups in the sink and thought about how many conversations we'd had there, never imagining that behind it lay a parallel life. He hurried out, as always, and I followed the automatic routine of tidying the house and organizing the bills. While folding the napkins, I decided to open our shared email inbox again. I found nothing explicit, just clues I already knew. Restaurant reservations, strange movements. Even so, I memorized every detail, like someone compiling a dossier. It was almost a silent ritual of preparation, something that had already become part of me. At work, I tried to stay focused, but my mind kept returning to that notification that changed everything. I attended meetings, responded to emails, but nothing felt real. My colleagues noticed my fatigue and offered me coffee, but I just smiled automatically. I was no longer just myself. I was torn between the woman who still maintained a social facade and the one who secretly collected evidence. It was like living in two dimensions at once. At lunchtime, I stopped by the supermarket. As I pushed the cart, I noticed how each item brought back memories. I picked up a snack he loved, and for a moment I remembered when we'd shopped together, laughing at silly things. The memory brought me a pang of pain, but also clarity. I returned home feeling that, as painful as it was, I needed to maintain control. Only calm could guide me to the right moment. When I arrived, I found a note on the table written in haste. "I'm leaving late, don't wait." There was no affection or justification, just a dry sentence. For a second, I felt like ripping the paper and screaming, but I took a deep breath. I grabbed my phone, photographed the note, and put it away. It was another piece of the puzzle. He didn't realize it, but his every gesture became evidence against himself. The afternoon was spent cross-referencing information. I opened my calendar, noted the times he said he would be in certain places, and compared them with the Uber records that appeared in the email. The pattern was clear: nights of supposed meetings, incompatible schedules, strange locations. It wasn't just imagination. I was certain there was something solid. And with each new note, patience stopped being waiting and became strategy. My son came home from school and asked me to make juice. As I cut the fruit, I noticed how much quieter he had been these past few days. His smile was smaller, his eyes held something he didn't want to say. I didn't need him to say it. I knew he felt it. I promised everything would be okay, even though I knew it wasn't. And in that moment, I realized my fight wasn't just mine. It was also for him. Later, I went to the laundry and noticed that one of his shirts smelled different. It wasn't my perfume. It was a sweet, cloying aroma, like another woman's. I put the item in a separate bag and photographed the label just to document it. Even the mundane routine of doing laundry gave me clues he didn't realize he was leaving behind. Home life, once repetitive, was now the stage for my investigation. In a conversation with a friend, I heard that she also suspected her husband. We exchanged quick confidences, and I realized how stories like this are more common than one might think. What set me apart was the way I already had concrete evidence. I didn't just want advice, I wanted action. I knew my time was coming, and I needed to be ready. Her support was a small relief, but it didn't change what I had to do. A few days later, I found a folded piece of paper on the bottom of the sofa. It was a restaurant receipt, dinner time, 2 people. The address was the same neighborhood that my son had mentioned when he said he saw his father's car. I held the paper with a trembling hand, but at the same time I felt a strange calm. It was no longer intuition. It was a fact. The betrayal was there, recorded on paper, like a signature of the lie. That night we had dinner together. I talked about our son's school, work, normal things. He responded without enthusiasm, his eyes always shifting to his cell phone. It was like talking to someone who was no longer there. When he finished, he stood up and gave me a quick kiss on the forehead, like someone performing a ritual. I smiled on the outside, but inside there was nothing but emptiness. There was no longer room for love, only for calculation. Lying down, I thought about how to expose everything. I didn't want an empty scandal. I wanted clarity. I wanted him to feel the weight of his own lies. I imagined what it would be like to show the receipts, the prints, the proofs. I visualized the scene, not with tears, but firmly. He needed to listen to me without space for denial, in the face of facts that would speak for me. The next day, I decided to visit one of the reservation addresses I had found. I parked nearby and watched from inside the car. It was an ordinary restaurant, people coming and going, nothing fancy. But there was living proof that he built moments outside of our lives. I wrote down license plates, times, even details of the facade. I was not a suspicious wife. I was a silent investigator. Later, the family organized an event and he said he would go. I said I would attend too. It was part of my plan to observe how he behaved in public. He wanted to see how he held up the mask in front of people who believed in him. It was curious to see how the lie remained in bright places. And I knew that when darkness came, he would have nowhere to hide. At the event, I noticed how he worked hard to appear like the perfect husband. He talked to colleagues, told jokes, greeted everyone with kindness. But with each gesture, I saw the actor. I saw how none of it was real. He approached a coworker, laughed loudly, touched her arm. The scene was almost innocent to anyone watching from the outside. But for me, it was further proof of how far he had already distanced himself from us. We returned home in silence. My son was already asleep, oblivious to the theater we were witnessing. He went straight to the bedroom, and I sat on the sofa, observing the emptiness of the room. That space was no longer home. It was a fake stage. I looked at the walls, at the family photos, and felt the weight of the farce. None of that represented the life we lived anymore. In the following days, I noticed details that I hadn't noticed before. He left the window half open, left objects out of place, and always left in a hurry. I wrote everything down in a notebook, crossing information. With each note, the certainty increased. Real life, with its small mistakes, gave me evidence that he never imagined he was leaving behind. I found a name in his diary repeated at strange times. I wasn't a supplier, I wasn't a customer. They were short but frequent meetings. I photographed it and included it in my archive. I already had enough evidence to take him down in front of anyone. It was just a matter of time to turn everything into an exhibition. And I was no longer in a hurry. I was convinced. I talked to a cousin and a close friend, showing part of what I already had. They were silent when they saw the documents, then offered me support. They didn't ask for details. They just said they would be by my side when I needed them. That validation gave me strength. I was no longer just a betrayed woman. I was someone ready to turn history around. That night, I went to bed tired, but with a different peace. I knew I had enough in my hands to change the course of everything. I looked up at the ceiling and realized the revelation wouldn't just be a confrontation. It would be a profound impact that no one could ignore. It wasn't about me and him anymore. It was about exposing the truth he hid so much. And when I put all the documents back together, my heart felt firm. There was no more room for doubts or insecurity. What lay ahead was inevitable. And when it happened, he would have to face every lie he maintained. The time was approaching, and I was ready to tear everything down at once. The days passed with the feeling that every detail of the routine hid a secret. The sound of his car parking, the quick way he put his backpack away, even the perfume that arrived before his presence. I no longer needed imagination. Reality itself gave me signs. It was like living inside a puzzle where the pieces revealed themselves. I started to notice small gestures that previously went unnoticed. He changed his shirt as soon as he arrived, as if he wanted to erase some trace. The cell phone never left my pocket, not even to leave it on the table during dinner. And when it vibrated, his expression changed for an instant, almost imperceptibly. That was enough to confirm that there was someone on the other side. One night, while he was taking a shower, I heard the muffled sound of notifications coming from the bathroom. He had taken his cell phone there, like someone who couldn't let go. I stood at the door for seconds, feeling my heart race. There were no doubts, just the cruel certainty that I was no longer the priority. I took a deep breath and returned to the room, carrying the silence like armor. At work, I realized that I was no longer the same. My colleagues commented that I was more serious, less involved in light conversations. They didn't know, but I was already living in a constant state of observation. Life had become a diary of silent espionage. I was the narrator of my own pain, but also the investigator who recorded every movement. My son continued to bring truths without realizing it. He once said, "Mom, Dad always leaves us waiting at the school gate." The phrase sounded innocent, but it went through me like a knife. He noticed the delays, felt the absence, but didn't understand the reasons. I wondered how long it would take for him to connect the dots on his own. I decided to take another step. I started checking his credit card statement that he rarely used. There were small but frequent values in coffee shops, pastry shops, and restaurants. Nothing grand, but enough to suggest meetings. He didn't spend much because the biggest cost wasn't financial, it was morale, and he could never afford that. One rainy afternoon, I decided to test his reaction. I casually asked if he wanted to go out to dinner with me on the weekend. He hesitated for seconds before answering. "I can't do this Saturday. I have a short work trip." I made a mental note and waited. On the same day, I found a reservation at a hotel made in advance. The contrast between the lie and the proof was stark. I came home and watched him as if he were a stranger. He talked about work, commented on the traffic, but I no longer heard anything. The sound of his voice was just a backdrop to the scene I was playing in my mind. I knew where he would go, who he would be with, and how long the charade would last. And I was ready to turn that into definitive evidence. On Friday, when he left with his small suitcase, I hugged my son and told him we would spend the weekend together. I put a mask of normality on my face, but inside there was a calculated plan. As soon as his car turned the corner, I checked my email again. The confirmation of the stay was there, stamped with time and address. I got the car the next day and drove to the hotel. I didn't need to go in. I didn't need to talk to anyone. I just watched from afar, registering the license plate number of his car parked in front. The image was enough to record in memory the truth that could no longer be erased. I kept the record on my cell phone, taking my time, as if I knew there was more to come. I returned home with my mind boiling. I made lunch for my son, sat down with him, and we chatted. I wanted him to feel that despite everything, I was there. The contrast between his purity and the dirt of that situation tore me apart. But it also made me stronger, because now I knew I was fighting for both of us. In the evening, he called saying he was exhausted from the meeting. His voice seemed trained with strategic pauses, as if he had rehearsed the lie. I responded calmly, wishing him good night. I hung up the phone and stared at the screen for minutes. There was no pain, just coldness. I was no longer the injured woman. I was the witness preparing the revelation. On Sunday, when he returned, he entered the house with flowers in his hands. They were beautiful, well chosen, as in the first years of marriage, but the gesture didn't touch me. It was a cheap attempt to cover up the smell of betrayal. I took the flowers, thanked them, and placed them in the vase. They became a symbol of the theater that he insisted on supporting. We ate dinner in silence. He talked about the trip and the clients, describing invented details. I chewed slowly, registering each word. It was like watching an actor improvising on an empty stage. The public already knew the truth, but he believed he was in control. This contrast fueled my patience. That night, he lay down exhausted and fell asleep quickly. I stayed awake, looking at the ceiling and organizing the next steps. I didn't just want loose evidence. I wanted a complete file, impossible to dispute. When the confrontation came, he would have no way out. And that was what kept me firm, even in the face of so many lies. I started getting closer to people who could be important when everything came to light. A trusted friend, a close cousin, attentive colleagues. I showed part of the evidence and asked for confidentiality. They were shocked but promised support. That gave me more strength. I was no longer alone. I was building a silent network of witnesses. Over the next few days, I noticed how comfortable he seemed to lie. He smiled, made plans, talked about the future. It was almost ironic, because I already knew that future no longer existed. He lived a fantasy that only made sense to him. I, on the other hand, was preparing to destroy this fantasy once and for all. My son started having nightmares and calling me at night. When I lay down next to him, he felt his breathing heavy and realized how the instability was already affecting his safety. I promised everything would be fine, but I knew I needed to act soon. I couldn't let him be contaminated by the same weight that I carried in silence. One Wednesday afternoon, I found another detail, a restaurant business card stored in his wallet. The name was the same as what appeared on the receipts. I held the card for a few seconds, then photographed it and returned it to its place. It was impressive how he left such visible traces. Maybe he trusted too much in the idea that I would never look. I started planning how and where the confrontation would take place. It would not be on impulse nor in an empty discussion. It would be in front of people who mattered, in front of those he least expected. I wanted the impact to be not just emotional, but social, that he understood the extent of the destruction he had caused. Meanwhile, I continued living the routine as if nothing was happening. I would wake up, prepare coffee, take my son to school, work. To any observer, I was just an ordinary woman. But inside, each gesture was rehearsed to maintain balance until the right time. I was no longer a victim. I was a strategist. One weekend, he suggested a family trip in an attempt to maintain his image. I accepted immediately, not because I wanted to, but because I knew it would give me more time to observe. During the trip, I noticed how he tried to compensate with gifts, forced laughter, and photos to post on social media. It was an empty spectacle. I posed for photos, but each image was an irony. As we smiled for the camera, I thought about the evidence I had stored in a secret folder. Those records, one day, would speak much louder than any happy photograph. He had no idea that he was already surrounded by his own lie. Upon returning, I left my suitcase in the living room and went straight to organize my files. It was as if each new gesture of his gave me more energy to follow. The collection of evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. I knew that when the time came, there would be no way for him to defend himself. I looked at the smartwatch he had left charging on the table. That object, a symbol of control and routine, was also the key to much of what he hid. All it took was one failure, one distraction, and I would have access to what was missing. The irony was painful. The technology he used to disguise himself could be the very technology that would destroy him. That night, I sat on the couch, looked at the house, and felt like my life was about to change for good. There was no turning back, no more room for love or illusion. What remained was the certainty that his fall would be as great as the trust he destroyed. And I was ready to pull the last piece that supported that charade. The air felt heavier, and the silence in the house sounded like a warning. Confrontation would not only be inevitable, it would be devastating. And when the truth came out, nothing would ever be the same again. That morning, he left for work as if nothing had happened, but I no longer saw the routine in the same way. When I passed the table in the living room, I realized that he had forgotten his smartwatch charging. It was like finding an access key to what I was looking for. I spent a few seconds looking at the device, feeling the temptation to touch it, but I restrained myself. It didn't need to be at that moment. The simple fact that he left it behind was enough to show me that the gaps were beginning to appear. Throughout the day, as I worked, I kept thinking about how to take advantage of this opportunity. I knew that a hasty hack could put me at risk, but I was also aware that this device contained precious data. Routes, steps, schedules, and even heartbeats could tell stories he couldn't imagine. I smiled alone, in silence, realizing how his carelessness was beginning to turn against him. It was only a matter of time before I had the confirmation I was missing. At night, when he arrived, I made a point of observing every detail. The strong perfume, the impeccably ironed shirt, and that way of using your cell phone as if it were an extension of your body. We ate dinner in silence, and I noticed how his eyes darted from the table to the screen with each vibration. I didn't need to say anything because the gestures already spoke for themselves. I just chewed slowly, absorbing everything as material for my analysis. In the following days, I continued my observation process coolly. The lies were always accompanied by small slips. I found crumpled receipts in pockets, invoices forgotten in the car, and messages that hadn't been completely deleted. I saved every detail, organizing it into folders and photos so as not to run the risk of forgetting. The more I saw, the less I felt. The love that remained had already become an archive of evidence. What hurt me was seeing how my son also noticed changes. He didn't speak clearly, but his looks revealed that he understood more than he wanted to admit. He asked why his father didn't arrive on time or why he didn't have dinner with us anymore. I smiled, tried to distract, but I knew the child registered everything. The betrayal wasn't just against me, it was against the family foundation. And that filled me with a cold anger that gave me the strength to carry on. One afternoon, I found a business card inside a book on the shelf. The name printed on it was the same one that had previously appeared on a restaurant reservation. I took a photo and returned it to its place without changing anything. Sometimes it even seemed like he wanted to be discovered. He was so careless. But I didn't rush, because each piece of evidence I collected was another thread in the plot that I controlled. He thought he was fooling me, but I was already the one dictating the pace of the story. I talked to a close friend and showed her part of what I had gathered. She was in shock, but offered me immediate support. It wasn't about advice, it was about testimony. I wanted people who, at the right time, could confirm everything I said. It was forming a silent, discreet, but powerful network. It wouldn't be an impulsive revenge, it would be a planned, calculated, and definitive exposure. I continued cross-checking information between what he said and what the records showed. Schedules didn't match, routes were incompatible, and even excuses about meetings had holes that were easy to see. The pattern repeated itself so clearly that there was no longer room for doubt. What once seemed like paranoia was now a precise timeline of betrayal. I no longer looked for signs. I just confirmed the ones that accumulated on their own. I started thinking about how the revelation should happen. I didn't want screams or theatrical scenes. I wanted clarity, impact, and silence. I wanted him to be faced with evidence so solid that he wouldn't even dare try to deny it. I imagined what it would be like to place receipts, prints, and witnesses in front of him and watch the mask crumble. That thought gave me peace, because it was no longer revenge. It was justice. One Saturday, I went to the address of a restaurant that always appeared in the records. I parked the car a few meters away and watched. I saw his car parked out front, parked without concern. I didn't need to get closer. I didn't need to talk to anyone. I just recorded the scene on my cell phone, adding more evidence to the file. I returned home with my heart racing, but with the certainty that the end was near. That night, I organized the folders on the computer. I separated by dates, locations, and types of evidence: digital, physical, and testimonial. The file was becoming so robust that it was impossible to ignore. When the time came, there would be no escape. I was no longer just a deceived woman. I was the architect of an inevitable revelation. I looked at the family photos on the living room wall and felt a mixture of sadness and determination. That life portrayed no longer existed, but it still served as a reminder of what had been destroyed. The weight of the lie was unbearable, but the preparation to expose it strengthened me. I closed the digital folders and took a deep breath. Confrontation was not just inevitable, it was imminent. And when it came, nothing would ever be the same again. I woke up early and felt the weight of the day before I even got up. I looked at the house in silence and mentally counted the small pieces of evidence scattered around the corners. As I prepared coffee, I thought about how his every gesture had become a clue. There was an uncomfortable clarity. It was no longer suspicion, it was evidence. I took a deep breath and decided that today would be the day to accelerate the plan. On my way to work, I passed by the restaurant he frequented. I saw the movement of the street and imagined the conversations that were taking place there without my knowledge. I mentally noted times and exits, like someone putting together a map. The habit of observation would no longer let me go. That left the rest of the day with a taste of anticipation. At the office, I maintained my routine while my head ran through possibilities. I responded to messages and pretended to be normal, so as not to arouse suspicion. I used a break from work to check the latest photos and receipts I compiled. Each new item fit into an obvious and disturbing pattern. It seemed like his life was unfolding alone before my watchful eyes. At lunch, I met an old college friend by chance. We talked about small things, and I took the opportunity to feel how he might seem to other people. I noticed that my observation now had a goal: to understand how he behaved in public. This helped to calibrate the form and tone of what I would prepare. The world around me continued, indifferent to my listening. In the afternoon, I went to the bank to check statements and notes I had made. I compared dates and values, paid attention to patterns and repetitions. The banking system, which previously seemed distant to me, was now a trail of evidence. I put each document in order and photographed it for a safe backup. I felt a mixture of relief and anger with each confirmation. When I returned home, my son hugged me tightly at the door. I felt the weight of responsibility more than ever. As I prepared him lunch, I realized how his innocence was the strength that kept me centered. He couldn't allow the storm to destroy his peace. This certainty gave me renewed focus and courage. He arrived later with more impromptu apologies than usual. He played with his son as if nothing existed, and I watched every gesture. There was an automatism in his words that tired me, like an actor memorizing lines. I remained silent, leaving no room for confrontation without preparation. Every detail counted for the final piece I assembled. That night, I reviewed the folders and realized that something was missing, a record that left no room for reconstruction. I thought about the idea of a recording or an eyewitness that couldn't be refuted. I planned ways to obtain this element without putting anyone at risk. The need for irrefutable proof became a priority. The next day, I dropped my son off at school and decided to visit the places he mentioned. I observed facades, noted signs, and confirmed small details that had already been crossed. The town seemed small when mapped out by labels and receipts. It was strange how something so intimate spread into common places. I wrote everything down with precise calm. I received a message from a friend asking for a quick lunch. I agreed at the center and used the opportunity to open part of the dossier with someone I trusted. I showed her the receipts and the dates, and she swallowed in shock. I didn't need words to validate. Her confirmation gave me more confidence for the next step. Knowing that someone outside the family circle saw the same logic was decisive. On my way back to work, I passed by a car agency and checked the license plate that I had already recorded in photos. I confirmed that the vehicle had been parked there on coinciding dates. Practical verification consolidated the feeling that his lie was operational and repeated. I closed another folder in my mental file, counting the missing points. The truth machine worked slowly but efficiently. At home, my son wanted help with his homework, and I allowed myself a smile. That simple routine was what I needed to protect with all my energy. As I read the questions, I thought about how I would explain everything at the right time, so that he could understand without hurting him. Maintaining normality for him was a love strategy. Each maternal gesture also became part of the resistance. He called saying he was going to stay late because of a client. The voice had the usual tone of a rehearsed apology. I took the opportunity to review the list of witnesses I could call if necessary. I thought of colleagues, relatives, and close friends who would confirm the pattern. I didn't want to expose anyone unnecessarily, but I wanted reassurance. One afternoon, I found another receipt hidden in his jacket pocket. Photographing it was automatic. Returning it without fuss was necessary. I already knew that acting naturally was essential to maintaining the advantage. His confidence in maintaining the theater gave me space to collect more evidence. This calculated calm was my sharpest weapon. Over coffee, a neighbor commented about seeing someone who looked like my husband in a bakery at odd hours. I wrote down the report and thanked him, keeping a low profile. These casual confirmations served as small stones that steadied the path. The world seemed to conspire in bringing witnesses that I hadn't even explicitly sought out. I used everything to my advantage, with prudence. In the late afternoons, I started leaving small traps to confirm attendance, scheduled messages, time combinations that only he would understand. It wasn't about manipulating. It was about creating conditions for the truth to manifest itself. When human nature goes into repetition mode, mistakes appear, and I was ready to see them. At work, I decided to ask for time off to organize a visit that could be relevant. My boss understood, and I followed with a clear goal in mind. I made appointments, confirmed hypotheses, and took a deep breath before each step. Logistics needed to be perfect so as not to give rise to disputes. Planning became my new state of mind. One night, I went to a small event where he would also be there. I pretended to be natural and observed without interfering. I saw how he behaved in public and how he used social charm to protect himself. He spoke easily, and I noted tone of voice, gestures, and targets of attention. Knowing how he presented himself in public would help me dismantle his narrative when the time came. On Saturday, I left my son with my mother and went to an address that I had confirmed several times. I stayed at the right distance so as not to be noticed and recorded every movement. Seeing the pattern repeat itself live made me sure I wasn't mistaken. I came home with another piece of the puzzle. The collection of evidence was no longer vulnerable to empty claims. I started organizing everything in a clear chronological order, knowing that linearity helps expose contradictions. I typed reports, renamed photos, and pasted receipts into a hidden physical folder. The materiality of the evidence gave me comfort. It wouldn't just be words against words. When the need arises, each item would be ready to be presented. This care was essential. As I prepared dinner, I reflected on how much our lives had changed and felt deeply tired. It wasn't just the surveillance, it was the weight of having to decide the fate of a home. I cooked calmly and kept my usual mask on because my son needed to feel protected. The everyday routine has become a silent battlefield. Still, he persisted in acting with dignity. He arrived with an excuse about being late and brought chocolate for his son. I saw the scene and felt a mixture of repulsion and sadness. These small gestures attempted to erase a crack that was already too deep for superficial repairs. I kept the conversation light and noted the arrival time. Every detail counted for the narrative I wanted to present. In the early hours of the morning, I had an idea that could seal everything. A recording that clearly showed his presence in a compromising location. I thought about how to capture it without exposing third parties, and how to guarantee the authenticity of the material. It was risky, but if done well, it would be irrefutable. I planned the action down to the smallest detail, aware of every risk involved. On Sunday, I arranged with my trusted friend to do a discreet check in a public place. She agreed to be my witness, and we kept the plan secret. Her presence gave me the confidence to act more boldly. I didn't want to involve more people than necessary, just the minimum to confirm facts. Complicity was a relief. When I returned, I found a message in which he mentioned a name that I had not yet linked to the other records. I wrote it down and went back to research. The pattern began to unfold, and the relationship between names, places, and times became clearer. I felt like I was close to the point where everything would connect without gaps. This feeling increased my determination. I organized a meeting with the witnesses who had already agreed to help. I showed them part of the file and explained what we were trying to prove. They agreed to keep it confidential until I decided to formally present everything. The support network grew with responsibility and empathy. Having trustworthy people by my side eased some of the weight. In the last week, I have stepped up collecting digital evidence more carefully than before. I didn't manipulate anything. I just gathered data and repetitions of behavior. The material was becoming robust, capable of telling the story without emotional interpretations. When the time came, the truth would have its own voice, and I prepared myself to let him speak out loud. At the end of the afternoon, I sat with my son and played on the living room floor. His joy was medicine for a tired soul. I thought about how to protect that smile and how its future would depend on the choices I would make now. Family responsibility made me firm. The decision to act came less from resentment and more from protection. In the evening, I reviewed the final plan and felt a deep calm. Everything was aligned: evidence, witnesses, schedules, and strategies. There was no room for mistakes or impulsive outbursts. What came would be accurate and proportional to the damage. The coming fall would not be blind revenge, it would be exposing the lie in front of those who always believed in it. And as I closed the folders and put the file away in a safe place, I felt like something inside me had changed forever. It wasn't just the end of a story of betrayal, it was the beginning of another possible life for us. Tension still vibrated in the air, ready to turn into action. I organized all the evidence in order, separating receipts, prints, and testimonies into digital and physical folders. Every detail now formed a complete plot, impossible to dispute. As I watched my son sleeping peacefully, I felt the time was about to come. When the truth was revealed, there would be no reconstructing the mask he had worn for so long. When I laid all the evidence before him, silence was the only possible response. There was no defense, no explanation, just the weight of the exposed lie spreading through the air. I looked into his eyes and said that from now on, life would follow a different path, a path in which the truth would no longer be negotiated. And I left in the air the question that still echoes: how many people will continue to close their eyes to signs that scream every day?